Bedtime Story for Adults, The Watchmaker's Quiet Evening. By the time the town had given itself over to evening, the watchmaker's shop had already begun to slip away from the ordinary world. Outside, the street still belonged, for a little while longer, to the last movements of the day. A bicycle passed over the cobbles with a soft, irregular rattle. A woman in a dark coat closed the shutters of the bakery across the square. Somewhere farther down the lane, a door opened, then shut, and the sound was swallowed by the cooling air. Above the roofs, the sky had thinned into a patient blue-gray, and the first lamps had come on behind windows, one by one, as if the town were remembering itself by candlelight. Inside the shop, time did not so much pass as gather. Clocks covered nearly every wall. Small clocks, round-faced and neat, with porcelain numbers and brass hands delicate as eyelashes. Tall clocks in polished wooden cases that seemed less like furniture than like elderly relatives who had elected to stand quietly in corners and observe everyone. A row of travel clocks with folding covers. Mantel clocks under domes of glass. A regulator clock with a long, serious pendulum that crossed its narrow chamber with unwavering dignity. A silver pocket watch, disassembled, resting upon a square of dark velvet beneath the lamp, its tiny organs arranged in order so exact it resembled a star chart. They all moved, but slowly, not slow in the sense of delay, nor slowness caused by neglect. Rather, they moved with an untroubled precision that seemed to belong to another arrangement of the world. Their ticking was not hurried. Their springs held no anxiety. Their pendulums did not strive. Each clock, in its own manner, accepted the labor of the minute hand, the turning of the hour, the return of the chime, as if these were old and honorable tasks that required steadiness, not speed. The room was full of sound, yet none of it was loud. Ticking beneath ticking, a little brass heartbeat from the shelf near the window, the dry composed click of a wall clock above the cabinet of tools, the softer internal whisper of a small carriage clock awaiting reassembly, once every quarter hour, from the tall walnut case near the back curtain, a subdued note like a spoon touching crystal. All these small sounds met in the air and became not noise, but atmosphere. The lamp over the workbench glowed a deep amber color, casting its circle of light over brass tweezers, tiny screwdrivers, loop lenses, oiler pins, brushes fine as thoughts, and trays lined with blue felt. A second lamp burned in the front window, where old watch faces reflected gold into the street. Under this warm light the whole shop seemed held in suspension. Dust motes drifted but did not settle. Glass gleamed softly. Polished cases held the memory of hands. The floorboards, rubbed smooth by decades of feet, carried a hush that belonged not to emptiness but to careful use. The watchmaker sat alone at the bench. His name was Lucian Vale. He was not young, though neither was he so old as strangers often assumed. Precision had a way of giving a person an air of age before age truly arrived. His hair, once dark, had silvered first at the temples and then, with the quiet thoroughness of winter climbing a hillside, across the crown as well. His hands were long, steady, and marked by faint pale scars that only someone accustomed to tools would notice. One finger on the left bore a narrow line where a ring had once rested for many years. He no longer wore it, yet the skin still remembered. Lucien bent over the pocket watch on the velvet pad, loop fitted to his eye, and listened to the wheel train with the attention of a man listening not merely for error, but for temperament. Some mechanisms announced their troubles clearly. Others were vain. They insisted on appearing healthy while harboring an inconsistency so minute it would reveal itself only in the 4th minute after winding, or at the turn from 11 to 12, or when the weather changed and the air grew damp. Lucien respected both kinds. He did not take it personally when a clock concealed its distress. He understood concealment better than most. Beyond the front glass, the street dimmed further. A few last pedestrians crossed the square. Their reflections moved among the hanging clocks like temporary ghosts. Then they were gone. Lucien set down the tweezer, reached for the movement holder, and turned the pocket watch slightly beneath the lamp. "There you are," he murmured. He had developed, over the years, the habit of speaking quietly to the clocks. Not constantly, not in any theatrical way, merely as one speaks to a skittish animal, a sleeping infant, or a difficult old friend. Tiny phrases. Easy now. Not yet. There it is. Again. He had once been embarrassed by the habit. Then, after sufficient decades alone with mechanisms whose temperaments he knew more reliably than many human moods, embarrassment had seemed an unnecessary formality. The watch on the bench belonged to a schoolteacher named Mrs. Ansell, who lived 2 streets away and had the kind of punctuality that treated lateness as a moral weather event. The watch had belonged to her father before her, and to his brother before that. It had crossed a war in a coat lining, survived a flood in an attic trunk, and spent 7 years wrapped in linen in a drawer because no one trusted a local jeweler with anything that old. Last week, Mrs. Ansell had placed it in Lucien's hand and said, with the solemnity some people reserve for the vulnerable, "It has begun to lose itself." Lucien knew what she meant. The second's hand hesitated by the number 8. The beat was slightly uneven. The mainspring, though not broken, had grown tired in the way old metal grows tired, by microscopic surrender. Tonight he had already cleaned the plates, checked the pivots, and polished the jewel cups. Now he adjusted the hairspring, almost not touching it, and waited. The watch ticked. Once, twice, a measured little run of silver sound. Then steady. Lucien exhaled. Outside, in the street, the church bells struck 8. The sound entered the shop as if from a great distance, though the church stood only across the square. 8 calm notes. A small pause. Then silence again. Lucien removed the loop, rubbed one eye, and leaned back. He did this every evening when the light thinned and the town withdrew. He paused. He let the larger clocks continue their conversations overhead. He allowed his own body to return to him. The shoulders, the neck, the lower back that reminded him, politely but firmly, that he was not 30. In the front window the lamp shone against the twilight. making the glass mirror the room back onto itself. There were evenings when the shop felt like a place of work. There were other evenings, like this one, when it felt like a place removed from time's ordinary weather. As though the clocks, by agreeing to tick in concert, had made a separate country out of minutes. Lucien stood, stretched carefully, and crossed to the little stove at the back. On it sat a small kettle, not yet boiling, and beside it a blue ceramic teapot with a lid that never fit perfectly no matter how lovingly one set it down. He touched the kettle, judged it insufficiently hot, and added one split log to the stove. The fire answered with a soft shift of embers and the quiet polite crack of accepting more work. A narrow curtain divided the workshop from the small room behind, where Lucien kept a bed, a wardrobe, 3 shelves of books, and a table by the back window where he took his meals when he did not feel like balancing a bowl on the workbench. The back room was modest, but pleasant. He had learned, over the years, that modesty arranged with care can be warmer than abundance arranged carelessly. On the table stood a vase with 3 stems of dried fennel, a loaf of brown bread wrapped in cloth, and a note written in the slanted hand of the florist from the next street. For the rosemary, thank you. The rosemary had come from the box by Lucien's back door, where herbs survived under his care less by intention than by stubbornness. In return, the florist sometimes left him things: dried lavender in August, a pear in October, a candle just before the solstice. The town understood him kindly, not intimately, but enough. He returned to the front of the shop carrying a tray with 1 cup, the teapot, and a small plate of almond biscuits from the baker. He set the tray on the high stool beside the bench. Then he drew the ledger toward him and opened it to the page for repairs completed that week. The paper smelled faintly of dust and binding glue. Mrs. Ansell, silver pocket watch, cleaned and regulated. Monsieur Belot, carriage clock, escapement restored. Miss Evren, wristwatch, crystal replaced. Church vestry, wall clock, left spring mended. Pendulum case number 4, awaiting parts. Rosewood bracket clock, owner unknown, still observing. Lucien smiled a little at the last entry. The rosewood bracket clock had sat in the corner by the front window for nearly 6 months. No one had come to claim it. No note, no card, no memory, apparently, strong enough to retrieve it. The clock itself was handsome. Late 19th century, with a moon phase arch and a mellow chime whose tone suggested it had been expensive once and beloved at least twice. Lucien had repaired it weeks ago. Still it remained. He had begun to think of it as a quiet tenant. Steam rose from the spout of the teapot. Lucien poured, watched the amber liquid enter the cup, and breathed in the scent. Black tea, orange peel, a little clove. He had been making the same evening tea since the winter after his wife died. Though he did not think of it in those terms anymore. Not first. Now it was simply evening tea. Habit made gentle by repetition. Her name had been Celeste. At this hour, in the years when she lived, she used to sit in the armchair by the window with her mending basket or a book. one ankle tucked behind the other, listening to the clocks as if they were musicians who occasionally offended her taste. She had liked the smaller clocks best, the ones with modest opinions. She used to say. Lucien had once tried to argue that mechanisms did not possess opinions. Celeste had looked at him over the rim of her cup and replied, "That is because they do not confide in you in the way they confide in me." There had been no winning against such sentences. He lifted the tea. The amber light, the layered ticking, the drifting evening beyond the glass. All of it returned her to him, sometimes not as grief, but as atmosphere. A chair one did not move. A phrase stored in a drawer. The way a room learns someone and then continues, for years, to hold their shape in absence. Lucien drank. He was accustomed to solitude. More than accustomed. He had arranged a life capable of receiving it without complaint. The shop demanded attention but not noise. The clocks needed steadiness, not conversation. Town customers entered, spoke, thanked, departed. Days unfolded in measurable units and asked only that he meet them with accuracy. Yet there were evenings, especially in autumn when the light lowered itself early and the air outside turned glassy and cold. When solitude altered its texture, it became less like peace and more like distance. Not painful, merely noticeable, like the gap between one chime and the next when one had not realized how much one had been listening. The doorbell rang. Not sharply. It gave a low brass note, pleasant and slightly old-fashioned, as if announcing not intrusion but arrival. Lucien set down his cup and looked toward the front. A woman stood just inside the shop, the evening behind her like dark velvet through the glass. For a moment she did not speak. Perhaps because she too had been taken by the clocks. People often were. Their eyes moved first to the regulator, then to the wall of small enamel faces, then to the pendulums, and only afterward to Lucien at the bench. She wore a long charcoal coat and a scarf the color of faded plum. There were silver threads at one edge where the wool had been repaired by hand. Her hair was gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, though a few strands had escaped and held the lamplight with a copper-brown sheen. In one gloved hand she carried a square parcel wrapped in cloth. In the other, a narrow leather strap, at the end of which hung an old watch with its chain tangled. "I am sorry," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and had that particular steadiness which often conceals uncertainty better than tremor would. "I know it is late." Lucien rose. "Not too late," he said. "The shop is still open." This was, strictly speaking, only partly true. The sign on the door had been turned to closed at 6:30. But Lucien had never found much use in refusing evenings that arrived politely. The woman glanced toward the sign, then back at him. "Then perhaps the clocks are more forgiving than I am." That made something like amusement pass through him. "They often are," he said. She stepped farther in. The bell settled behind her. Warmth from the stove reached the front slowly. She seemed to notice it and unconsciously loosen her shoulders. "I was told," she said, looking around the room once more. That if there was anyone in town who might be able to help with this, it would be you. She lifted the watch slightly. Lucian came around the bench. Up close he saw that the watch was not a wristwatch, as he had first thought, but a small pendant watch on a long chain. The case dented near the hinge, the glass intact but clouded. The woman untangled the leather strap from it and laid both on the counter. "My aunt wore it for 40 years," she said. "Then it spent another 15 in a drawer because she said stopping was more dignified than being late. I have had it in my possession for 3 months and cannot decide whether bringing it to be repaired is an act of sentiment or denial." Lucian lifted the watch. It was lighter than it should have been. That usually meant wear, not quality. He opened the back case carefully. The movement inside was old but not remarkable. Plain silvered plates, lever escapement, dust at the edges. An honest watch, well made for daily use, then carried through years that do strange things to ordinary objects. He listened near his ear. No sound. "It has not been wound in some time," he said. 2 decades, perhaps. He glanced up. "Then sentiment is a perfectly respectable motive." The woman smiled, though it was the kind of smile that arrives cautiously, as if measuring the room first. "That is fortunate," she said, "as respectable motives are in short supply at present." Lucian turned the watch in his hand, studying the dent. "It may run again," he said, "but I should not promise before opening it fully. I would distrust a promise made that quickly." He looked up more directly then, and again that small current of amusement passed between them. Neither strong nor dramatic, but real. "That seems wise." She removed one glove, then the other, and set them beside the parcel. Her hands were long-fingered, with traces of ink near the side of the middle finger. Not recent ink, the kind left by fountain pens and notes written in margins. Lucian noticed these things without intending to. Years at a bench teach a person to see details before they know what to do with them. "Would you like me to leave it?" she asked. "Or have I committed the greater rudeness of arriving near closing with a complicated machine and an incomplete explanation?" Lucian considered the evening, the tea, the repaired pocket watch, the shop already withdrawn from the ordinary day. "You may leave it," he said, "and the explanation can remain incomplete for now. Many objects prefer that." At this the woman let out a breath that might almost have been relief. "Thank you." He reached for the intake card and pen. "Your name?" "Eleanor Ma." He wrote it carefully. "Address?" "Cedar Lane, the house beside the old school garden." Lucian nodded. He knew the house. Pale stone, ivy on the west wall, the upstairs window that kept a lamp late in winter. "And a contact number." She gave it. He attached the card to the chain with a ribbon of paper tape. When he looked up, Eleanor's gaze was not on him but on the clocks, moving from one to the next with a kind of attentive wonder. "They do sound different from one another," she said quietly. Lucian followed her gaze. "Yes. I used to think ticking was one sound. A general sound, like rain. It can be. If one is not listening. She turned slightly, still looking upward. And if one is. Then some clocks are impatient. Some are dignified. Some are vain. Some are exhausted. Some merely enjoy being heard. Eleanor smiled. You do assign 'em opinions. I have been accused of worse. Something about the way she stood there, hands resting lightly on the counter, coat still buttoned, evening at her shoulders, gave Lucian the strange impression that she had entered not merely a shop, but a room she had been missing without knowing it. Perhaps he was inventing that. He was, after all, a man accustomed to reading silence in mechanisms. Yet the sense remained. If you have a moment, she said, after a pause, may I ask a question that is probably foolish? Lucian gestured slightly. You may ask. Whether it is foolish remains to be seen. Do you ever feel, she said, choosing the words as if they had not fully consented to being spoken, that some rooms are keeping a different time from the rest of the world? Lucian did not answer immediately. The question entered the shop and seemed, oddly, to suit it. The regulator clock gave a measured click. A small French travel clock answered with a softer one. In the back, the rosewood tenant prepared its quarter chime. Then Lucian said, yes. Eleanor looked at him, perhaps expecting elaboration, perhaps surprised by the simplicity of it. He considered the room around them. The gold light, the clocks at labor, the darkening square outside. Not different in speed exactly, he said, more as if the usual pressure has been removed. Time continues, but it no longer leans. The quarter chime sounded then. 4 delicate notes, low and rounded, drifting out and dissolving. Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly to the counter, as though the answer had reached something she had not meant to expose. That is precisely it, she said. Lucian inclined his head, not in triumph, only recognition. A silence followed, not awkward, the sort of silence that happens when two people have unexpectedly located the same invisible object. Lucian might have let the evening end there. He might have offered to send word in a week, taken the pendant watch, returned to his bench, and watched Eleanor disappear into the blue-grey street among the baker's shutters and the last lamps. That would have been sensible. Instead, hearing his own voice before quite deciding upon it, he said, "The tea is still hot." Eleanor glanced up. "I have 1 cup," Lucian added, "but there are others in the back." A faint surprise passed over her face. Then caution, then something gentler. "I would not want to impose. It is only tea. And a room keeping a different time. That too." She hesitated 1 moment longer. Not from distrust, he thought, but from the carefulness of someone who did not step lightly into invitations she had not expected. Then she said, "In that case, perhaps only for a little while." Lucian went to fetch another cup. When he returned, Eleanor had removed her coat and draped it over the chair by the front window. Beneath it she wore a dark green dress and a cardigan of soft grey wool buttoned to the throat. She looked not fashionable exactly, but attentively put together. like someone who believed in clean lines and useful fabrics. Her parcel remained unopened on the counter. He poured tea into both cups and set the second near the bench. Eleanor looked down into it and smiled almost to herself. "Orange peel," she said. "And clove. My grandmother made winter tea like this." Lucian said nothing to that, only passed the plate of almond biscuits. She took one. The ticking continued around them. And because the room already contained sound enough, neither felt obliged to speak immediately. Eleanor walked slowly to the wall of hanging clocks nearest the window. Their faces reflected in the glass of the display case so that, for a moment, her profile seemed ringed with pale circles and moving hands. "This one is early," she said, pointing to a small cream-colored kitchen clock shaped like a sunburst. 3 minutes. Intentionally. "Yes." "Why?" Lucian sipped his tea. "It belonged to my mother. She believed arriving precisely on time was a species of carelessness." Eleanor laughed softly. "I see. So she kept it 3 minutes fast. Not enough to alarm anyone. Only enough to make the world wait for her rather than the reverse." "And you maintain that?" "I do." Her gaze moved to the regulator. "And that one?" "Exactly right. Or as near as possible." "That seems severe." "It is a regulator. Severity is part of its social role." "And the tall one in the corner?" Lucian followed her line of sight to the walnut case. "Slow by 12 seconds a day." "That feels almost philosophical." "It is old. It has earned 12 seconds." Again that small current of shared amusement. Eleanor came back toward the bench, tea in hand. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not usually the sort of person who accepts tea in unfamiliar watch shops after dusk." "I am relieved to hear it." "Are you?" "It would suggest carelessness." She looked at him over the cup. "And here I thought the clocks were the strict ones. I learned from them." She rested one hand on the back of the stool but did not yet sit. The light above the bench warmed one side of her face and left the other in gentler shadow. "I am a translator," she said after a while. "Mostly letters, essays, fragments, things no one is in a hurry to understand until they suddenly are. The hours are solitary. This week has been more so than usual." Lucian nodded. Translators made sense to him. People who listened for minute shifts between meanings. People who knew that precision could be intimate. "French and Italian," she continued. "Some German. Once. Disastrously. A commission involving Portuguese legal notes and a widow with very specific grievances." Lucian set down his cup. "And was justice done?" "To the grievances. Perhaps. Not to the Portuguese." That made him smile. She finally sat on the stool opposite the bench, though angled slightly so she could still see the clocks and the street. "My aunt's watch," she said, touching the intake card with one finger. "It is not the only reason I came." Lucian waited. "The truth is, I walked past this shop 3 times this week after dark." He lifted an eyebrow slightly. "The lamp was on each evening." The clocks looked. She searched for the word. Sheltered. I told myself I was only curious. Tonight I brought the watch because curiosity requires props if one wants to feel respectable. Lucian looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time through strangers' eyes. The amber lamp, the careful tools, the window full of quiet faces, the dark street beyond. Sheltered, he repeated. Yes. He turned the word over within himself. It fit, not elegantly perhaps, but truth often dresses more plainly than charm. My wife used to say this room had thick time, he said before deciding whether he meant to speak of Celeste aloud. Eleanor's expression changed, not sharply, only becoming more still. Thick time, she said, as opposed to crowded time, or thin time. She had categories. I think I understand at once. That was her gift. People usually did. A pause. Then Eleanor said, very gently, was. Lucian's hand rested lightly on the bench. Near it lay Mrs. Ansell's restored pocket watch, ticking now under a paper dome. 8 years ago, he said. The clocks continued their patient conversation around them. I am sorry, Eleanor said. He inclined his head. Thank you. She did not say more. Lucian was quietly grateful for that. Some sorrows need acknowledgement, not arrangement. He looked toward the armchair by the window, the one Celeste used to occupy in the evenings. It remained there still, upholstered in deep blue fabric faded at the arms. Customers sometimes assumed it was for waiting. Lucian let him think so, though no one ever chose it. The chair belonged too clearly to someone absent. She liked the evenings best, he said, when the town grew indistinct and the clocks had only each other to impress. Eleanor smiled into her tea. I like her already. So did most people. And you. The question was not careless, yet it entered the air with unexpected tenderness. Lucian looked down at his hands. There was a small screw mark near the thumb from earlier. Tea warmth remained in the cup. Very much, he said. Eleanor nodded once, accepting both the simplicity and the weight of it. Outside, rain began. Not heavy rain, only a fine autumn rain at first. The kind that writes itself onto window glass before anyone notices the sky has made a decision. Droplets gathered gold where the shop lamp struck them. The street beyond blurred slightly. The square took on that temporary intimacy rain gives to towns, as if the world had drawn closer under a shared coat. Eleanor turned toward the window. I should have brought an umbrella. Lucian followed her gaze. There is one by the door. Its loyalties are flexible. She laughed softly. You keep umbrellas for uncertain women. I keep umbrellas for weather and human misjudgment in all forms. Very sensible. The quarter hour approached. Lucian could feel it in the room before it happened. The strange anticipatory gathering that always preceded multiple chimes. He looked up at the clocks. Eleanor noticed. What is it? The quarter. Several of them believe in announcing themselves. Almost on cue, the room entered a brief sequence of sound. First the walnut case, 4 mellow notes. Then the rosewood bracket clock, brighter, with a gentler resonance. Then the carriage clock on the cabinet. A restrained double tone, almost embarrassed to participate. And finally, from the back room, the little French mantel clock, whose chime was so sweet and unnecessary that Celeste had once said it sounded like a polite guest applauding a sunset. Eleanor sat perfectly still while the sounds moved through the room. When they faded, she let out a breath. "It feels," she said, "like standing inside a thought." Lucien looked at her. He had spent years listening to clocks. He had used words like rhythm, interval, regulation, drift, chime, resonance. Yet that description, standing inside a thought, seemed closer to the truth of evenings like this than any technical term he knew. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does." They spoke more easily after that. About books first, because books are safer than histories and often lead there anyway. Eleanor translated letters from a 19th-century botanist who fell in love with mountain weather. Lucien repaired a clock for the librarian every February because the reading room radiators bullied its pendulum. Eleanor preferred margins with notes in several hands. Lucien preferred owners who admitted when a watch had been dropped. Eleanor mistrusted any prose that used the phrase, "timeless masterpiece." Lucien said the phrase was an insult to both masterpieces and time. The rain thickened. The street lost its final passers-by. The bakery across the square went dark. The florist's upstairs room glowed pale behind lace curtains. Somewhere a cat crossed under the awning of the closed tailor's shop, stopped to inspect the drainpipe, and vanished. As they spoke, Lucien opened Eleanor's pendant watch more fully. "May I?" he asked. "Or would you rather not watch it being found wanting?" Eleanor set down her cup. "Please. I would rather know the truth than make myths a dust." He approved of this sentence immediately. With slow care he released the back plate. The movement inside had indeed gathered years in all the ordinary, unforgiving places. Dust at the balance cock. Thickened oil gone nearly gummy at the pivots. The mainspring tired. Nothing catastrophic. Only neglect, which is often easier to mend than violence. "It is mostly exhausted," he said. "That sounds familiar." Lucien glanced up. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Can it be restored?" "Yes. It will require cleaning, regulation, and probably a new mainspring. The dent near the hinge may remain. It is part of the watch now." She looked relieved, though the relief carried something else beneath it. A tenderness perhaps, or the quiet gratitude people feel when old things are not beyond return. "My aunt would have appreciated that," she said. She distrusted all restoration that erased evidence. "Then she and I would have agreed." Eleanor drew one finger along the rim of her cup. "She taught piano," she said, "poorly. By reputation. Magnificently. By loyalty. Children hated her scales and adored her at Christmas. She wore this watch on a chain with every dress. Even gardening. When it stopped, she said, 'Well, I suppose that settles that,' and put it away." Lucien smiled. "She sounds formidable." She was. She believed sentimental people should at least have clean shoes. A principle of some merit. Eleanor looked around the shop again. Slower this time, as though the room had become legible in another way. "And you," she said, "do people bring you only clocks?" Lucian pretended to consider. "Watches. Occasionally." She gave him a look that carried the edge of laughter. "I meant," she said, "do they bring you the stories attached to them? Often without knowing they are doing so. And do you keep them?" He returned the movement carefully to its holder. "Not all. One must not become crowded. But some remain." "How do you decide?" Lucian looked at the row of clocks by the window. One small brass desk clock had belonged to a sea captain who feared churches. Another travel clock came from a woman who crossed a border with it sewn into a hem. A simple alarm clock with chipped enamel had been brought in by a baker who claimed it had ruined 30 years of sleep, and then cried quietly when Lucian returned it running. "I suppose," he said, "the stories decide whether they are leaving." Eleanor did not answer immediately. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, "I have found that to be true of several things." The rain went on. Lucian rose to light the second lamp in the front window. The room deepened in gold. Reflections doubled. The clocks seemed, for a moment, suspended not on walls but in warm dusk itself. Eleanor watched him strike the match. Shield it with one hand. Touch flame to wick. "My husband hated yellow light," she said suddenly. Lucian turned. The sentence had entered the room as plainly as a dropped pin. Eleanor kept her eyes on the lamp. He said it made every room look undecided. He preferred white light, clear edges, clinical certainty. She smiled faintly, though no amusement lived in it. "I preferred yellow. I said life looked less accusing in amber." Lucian said nothing. He had learned there are moments when silence is not absence but landing space. "We were married 12 years," Eleanor continued, "then 4 more, if one counts the years in which the marriage remained structurally present and humanly absent. I am not always sure whether to count them." The regulator clock continued its patient click. Lucian came back to the bench but did not sit yet. "And now we are no longer married. Officially since spring. Unofficially much longer." The rain made a fine moving pattern on the front glass. Somewhere in the back room, the little mantel clock prepared its half-hour. "I am sorry," Lucian said, and meant it not as consolation but as recognition of labor. Eleanor gave a tiny shrug. "So am I, though perhaps not in the usual direction." Lucian understood enough of that to nod. "I do not miss him," she said. "That is the difficult respectable truth. What I miss, sometimes, is the version of myself who spent years trying to make a life from colder materials than she needed." The half-hour chimed, a small bright sequence, then quiet. Lucian sat across from her. "It can take time," he said slowly, "to realize one has mistaken endurance for devotion." Eleanor looked at him then, sharply enough that he knew the sentence had reached its mark. "Yes," she said. The word stayed between them. Lucian had not intended to say anything so direct. Yet the evening, the ticking, the rain, the amber light, all had conspired to reduce the appetite for decorative speech. "My wife and I were not unhappy," he said after a while. "Not in that way. We were fortunate. But after she died, I discovered there are other kinds of endurance. The endurance of absence. The endurance of rooms that keep their shape. The endurance of being expected nowhere in particular, after 6 o'clock. Eleanor's face softened. "Yes," she said again, quieter. Lucian turned the pendant watch in its holder. "I do not say this from complaint," he added. "Only accuracy." "Accuracy," Eleanor repeated. "A watchmaker's moral preference." "One of them." "What are the others?" He almost smiled. "Patience. Humility before small forces. Respect for cumulative error." She laughed then, genuinely, and the sound altered the room in a way so immediate Lucian felt it physically. Like a window opened in spring. "Respect for cumulative error," she said. "That may be the most useful sentence I have heard all month." "Then the tea has earned its keep." Eleanor leaned back on the stool, cup in both hands. The rain, having settled into steadiness, seemed to draw a curtain around the shop. The town beyond the glass became less distinct. A lamp, a doorway, wet cobbles taking the gold reflection. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding entrance. "It is strange," Eleanor said, almost as if to herself, "how quickly one can feel quiet in the right room." Lucian looked around. The clocks, the bench, the warm lamp, the careful shadows. Perhaps the room was prepared in advance, he said. She turned slightly toward him. "For whom?" He considered. "Anyone arriving with more noise inside them than they wished to carry further." That made her still again. "I walked in with a great deal of noise," she admitted. "And now?" She listened. To the clocks perhaps. To the rain. To the stove at the back settling deeper into heat. "Less," she said. "They let that be enough." After a time Eleanor asked whether all the clocks were synchronized. Lucian said certainly not. That such tyranny would destroy half their character. She wanted to know which one was oldest. He showed her a dark little French wall clock with painted flowers faded to almost nothing. 1820s, possibly earlier. She asked which one lied most persistently. He indicated a gilt mantel clock with excessive ornament and a tendency to gain 7 minutes whenever admired. Eleanor said she respected its vanity. Lucian confessed he did too. In return she told him about a translation she had once spent 6 weeks correcting because one dead philosopher used the same word to mean soul. Breath, wind, temper, and civic disposition. Lucian asked whether the philosopher had disliked readers. Eleanor said almost certainly. Lucian asked whether she won. Eleanor said no one wins against the dead. But one may at least make their ambiguities behave. He liked the shape of her mind. That was the simplest version of it. The way she chose words not for decoration but fit. The way she could be wry without becoming sharp. The manner in which she attended to the room rather than occupying it by force. He liked, too, that nothing in the evening required haste toward intimacy. There was comfort in that restraint. Two people seated among clocks while rain drew the town smaller outside. Tea cooling. Biscuits broken in half. Time no longer leaning. When the church bell across the square struck 9, Eleanor startled slightly. I had not realized. Lucian looked up. 9 notes entered, blurred by the rain. This room commits small thefts, he said. I see that. She set down the cup, and for the first time the possibility of departure entered the shop with a discernible shape. It did not make the room colder, but Lucian felt it like a draft before one finds the window. I should go, Eleanor said. The sensible part of him agreed. The town was small, but not so small that evenings ought to become stories before they had even completed themselves. The rain had softened. Her house on Cedar Lane was not far. She had, after all, come to leave a watch, not to alter the weather inside a watchmaker's shop. Yet another part of him, quieter and older and perhaps more accurate, recognized that something rare had happened. Not a miracle, not destiny, simply the meeting of ease and recognition at an hour when both were unusual. Lucian stood. Take the umbrella, he said. Its loyalties remain flexible. Eleanor smiled. I will return it. That would be convenient. And if I forgot, it would be an administrative heartbreak. She rose and reached for her coat. As she buttoned it, her gaze fell on the square parcel she had left unopened on the counter. I nearly forgot this. Lucian looked at it. Brown cloth, twine tied carefully. It is bread, she said, or was meant to be. The baker on Alder Street added too much rosemary to an order and looked close to despair when I passed. I told him I would relieve him of 1 loaf. Then I walked past your window and here we are. She placed the parcel on the bench. Lucian stared at it a moment longer than courtesy required. Rosemary bread, he said. Yes, if you dislike rosemary, I can take it away and we shall all pretend this never happened. Lucian thought of the florist's note in the back room. For the rosemary, thank you. He thought of Celeste, who used to tear rosemary bread into soup. He thought of the empty room behind the curtain. I do not dislike rosemary, he said. Then it seems the evening has become practical after all. She drew on her gloves, though slowly, as if neither of them wished to hurry this final ordinary movement. At the door Lucian handed her the umbrella. It was black, somewhat elderly, and had one rib that preferred its own direction in strong wind. Eleanor accepted it with the solemn courtesy due shared objects. I will send word about the watch, he said. And if I grow impatient before then, you may walk past the window 3 times and invent another respectable errand. That surprised a laugh from her. I may do exactly that. The bell gave its low brass note as he opened the door. Rain-cooled air entered, carrying wet stone and chimney smoke. Eleanor stepped onto the threshold, then paused. Mr. Vale. Lucian, he said, and then, because the evening had already left formality politely behind, if you like. She held the umbrella closed for a moment. Lucian, she said, trying the name with a quiet certainty that made it feel less like novelty than recollection. "Thank you for the tea, and for the room." He inclined his head. "Good night, Eleanor." She opened the umbrella and stepped into the rain. The black dome moved through the gold reflection on the cobbles, turned at the square, and then was gone into the narrow lane beside the florist's house. Lucian closed the door. At once the shop became itself again. And not itself. The clocks continued. Tick, click, pendulum. The stove gave a low settling sound. Rain whispered along the front glass. The amber lamp burned over the bench. The repaired pocket watch under its dome kept steady time. Yet the room had altered in the peculiar way all meaningful rooms do after witness. It had been entered differently, seen not merely as workplace, nor shrine to old machinery, but as shelter, thick time, standing inside a thought. Lucian remained by the door a moment longer than necessary. Then he carried the rosemary bread to the back room. He unwrapped it on the small table. The smell rose at once. Warm flour and herb and faint oil. He cut 2 slices though he required only 1. Then smiled faintly at his own habit, adjusted, and left the second for tomorrow. He toasted the first over the stove and ate it with butter while the clocks at the front shop carried on their layered work. In the armchair by the window the blue fabric held its usual shadow. Lucian sat opposite, at the back table, and found that for the first time in many evenings the solitude of the room did not feel like a sealed condition. It felt instead like a shore after a boat has departed, still itself, but visibly connected to elsewhere. He opened the ledger again, though there was nothing left to record. His eyes moved to the space beneath Eleanor Ma. Pendant watch. Intake pending. Without entirely knowing why, he added a note in the margin. Customer prefers amber light. Arrived in rain. Watch likely restorable. He looked at the sentence, almost embarrassed by its quiet irrelevance. Then he closed the ledger. When he prepared for bed later, extinguishing the front lamp and lowering the stove, he moved through the rooms with an unusual attentiveness, as if checking whether they too had noticed. The regulator kept its perfect severity. The early kitchen clock remained 3 minutes fast. The rosewood tenant observed all without comment. In the front window the reflections dimmed one by one as he turned down the lights. At last only the smallest lamp remained. The one Celeste had once called the merciful lamp because it forgave corners for being corners. Lucian stood in the middle of the shop. Darkness had deepened beyond the glass. The rain had almost stopped. A silver wetness remained on the street where the lamp still reached it. The clocks, relieved of visual attention, seemed to sound clearer in half-light. Not louder, only more inward. Tick and return, tick and return. Tiny assurances made into atmosphere. He thought of Eleanor's question. Do you ever feel that some rooms are keeping a different time from the rest of the world? Yes. He had answered quickly because it was true. But now, standing there alone with the clocks and the faded armchair and the smell of rosemary still lingering from the back room, he understood another part of the truth. Different time is not only about slowness. It is about proportion. Some rooms restore it. They take one evening and allow it to contain enough listening, enough warmth, enough measured silence, that it no longer feels like a narrow strip between one obligation and the next. It becomes inhabitable. Lucian extinguished the merciful lamp. He climbed the narrow stair to the room above the back shop where he slept. The room was plain, almost monkish, save for the quilt Celeste had sewn years ago from old shirts and dress scraps. There were squares of blue, green, cream, burgundy, and one pale gold panel cut from a summer dress he could still picture with unreasonable clarity. He undressed, folded his waistcoat over the chair, and lay down. Below him the clocks continued. Some people, hearing so many clocks at night, imagined it impossible to sleep. Lucian had never understood that. To him, the layered ticking was not disturbance but companionship. It asked nothing. It only kept 1,000 tiny acts of continuation. 100 declarations that motion, even minute motion, still existed. He lay with one hand behind his head, looking at the ceiling darkened by the last of the rain. 8 years since Celeste. One quiet room. A pendant watch waiting below. An umbrella gone out into the night with a woman who preferred amber light. He did not frame these things as omen. He distrusted omen. Watchers had taught him too well that grand meaning usually arrives wearing overconfident clothes. More often life changes by increments nearly too small to notice while they happen. A conversation, a cup, a room seen and named, a sentence that lands where one has lived silently for years. He slept. Morning brought clear weather. The square shone where rain had cleaned the cobbles. The bakery across the way opened early, and warm yeasted air drifted through the crack above Lucian's front door before he even unlatched it. The florist swept her step. 2 school children passed, sharing one scarf and half an argument. Day resumed its ordinary negotiations. Lucian worked. He cleaned Eleanor's pendant watch with the patient exactness reserved for objects still carrying someone's pulse in memory. The mainspring indeed needed replacing. One pivot showed mild wear. The balance could be saved. He laid the parts in order on blue felt and, while working, found himself thinking not only of the watch's former owner, the piano teacher with clean shoe principles, but of Eleanor's face in lamplight when the quarter chimes sounded. By noon the watch was no longer exhausted, not fully restored yet, but willing. Tick. A small, tentative sound, like a bird deciding whether the branch beneath it could be trusted. Lucian smiled down at it. "That will do," he murmured, "for now." The days that followed arranged themselves with outward normality. Customers came and went. Mrs. Ansell reclaimed the silver pocket watch and wept in the severe composed way of women who dislike doing so in public. The librarian brought in a carriage clock with indigestion, by which she meant an irregular strike. The baker sent over 2 sugared buns because the church vestry clock had resumed ringing the quarter hours before weddings. A matter apparently of practical urgency. Lucian wound, polished, measured, and adjusted. Yet beneath these ordinary tasks another rhythm had begun. On the second evening after the rain, just before dusk, Eleanor returned the umbrella. She arrived without pretense this time. No parcel, no respectable errand except the obvious one. She wore the same charcoal coat, though a different scarf, dark blue with narrow cream lines. The umbrella, folded and properly dried, rested in her hand like a diplomatic offering. "I have come," she said, "to restore the administrative balance." Lucian took the umbrella. "The office is grateful. And I," she added, glancing around the room, "may have been curious whether the clocks continued in my absence." They did, with admirable self-regard. "Good." He told her the pendant watch was progressing well. She asked whether it was offended by surgery. He said mildly. She accepted tea without requiring an additional justification. This time she sat in the blue armchair by the window, after hesitating only briefly, and Lucian found that the sight of it no longer felt solely like a disturbance to memory. It felt also like permission, not replacement. Never that. Memory and newness, he discovered, do not always oppose one another. Sometimes they sit in the same chair on different evenings, and the room, if it is honest, makes space. The next week she brought him a page of translated botanical insults from the 19th century, claiming no one else in town would appreciate them sufficiently. He countered by showing her a marine chronometer he had no business possessing, except that the retired harbour master trusted him more than he trusted his nephew. Eleanor read by the bench while Lucian worked. Once she fell quiet for so long he thought she had gone inward entirely. But then she looked up and said, "I had forgotten that silence could be shared without being managed." Lucian did not answer at once because the sentence entered him with unusual force. Finally he said, "So had I." Their evenings did not become frequent enough to raise eyebrows, nor rare enough to be accidental. A measure emerged. Tea one Thursday, bread the next Tuesday, 15 minutes that became an hour, 1 hour that remained only 1 hour, and was perhaps therefore trustworthy. The clocks approved by continuing to do exactly as they had always done. Autumn deepened. The leaves in the square went from brass to rust to a color almost black-red after rain. Wind carried chimney smoke low along the street in late afternoons. The florist changed the window from dahlias to dried hydrangea and branches of berry. The baker made fig tarts no one admitted buying as often as they did. Lucian repaired more clocks than usual because cold weather reveals where old springs have begun lying about their strength. One evening Eleanor arrived carrying a small stack of letters tied in ribbon. "What are those?" "My current torment," she said, "a naturalist writing to his sister from Northern Islands. He spends 6 pages describing lichen and then says, almost incidentally, 'I do not think I was made for marriage.' It is impossible not to admire him." Lucian looked up from a brass carriage clock whose alarm preferred midnight regardless of instruction. And was he made for marriage? Apparently not. He was, however, ideally made for basalt and loneliness. Lucian nearly lost his hold on the screwdriver from laughing. Another evening he showed her the moon phase clock, And she asked whether people once trusted the moon more than they trusted numerals. Lucian said at least they suspected numbers less. She stood very close to the case while he advanced the disc. Watching the painted moon rise through clouds worn nearly transparent by time. Imagine, she said, believing the phases belonged in the sitting room. Everything belongs in the sitting room if framed in enough walnut. These small exchanges accumulated. Respect for cumulative error, Eleanor called it once, smiling into her cup. Or perhaps, Lucian thought, respect for cumulative tenderness. Late in November, on a cold evening when the square had emptied early and the first true winter smell lived in the air, Eleanor came in looking tired. Not theatrically tired, not ruined, only thinned. Lucian noticed it before she spoke. The way her scarf had been wrapped without its usual exactness. The faint tension around her mouth. The eyes that were present but carrying too much unfinished thought. He said nothing at first. He only took her coat, set water for tea, and moved a small brass clock from the stool so she could sit. After a while, when the room had done enough of its work to lower the day's volume, Eleanor said, "My former husband is remarrying." Lucian placed the teapot carefully on the tray. "I found this out," she continued, "through a cousin who believes news should be delivered promptly, like invoices or fish." The clocks kept on. Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I do not want him back. I do not even want the life. But I seem to have become unexpectedly angry on behalf of the years." Lucian poured the tea. "That is allowed," he said. Eleanor let out a breath. "I know. I simply dislike how ungraceful anger feels in the body." Lucian handed her the cup. "Grace is overrated on such evenings." She smiled faintly, but her eyes brightened with unshed tears she clearly had no interest in displaying. Lucian respected that too. He did not move nearer. He did not offer consolation in bulk. He only said, after a measured silence, "You are not required to be generous toward a chapter that cost you more than it returned." Eleanor looked up very slowly. "No," she said. "No." The regulator clicked on. The walnut case kept its 12 seconds a day philosophy. Rain had not come that night, but wind brushed the window with a dry, restless sound, moving leaves along the square. After some time Eleanor laughed, unexpectedly and with real humor, though tears still waited at the edge of it. "He always hated these kinds of rooms," she said. "The room, the clocks, the gold light, the sense that one might have to feel something unmeasured." Lucian sat opposite her. "Then the room and I are aligned." This made her laugh properly, and one tear escaped despite herself. She wiped it away with the side of her finger, annoyed and amused at once. "That," she said, "is perhaps the kindest thing anyone could have said without sounding kind." Lucian inclined his head slightly. A useful specialty. That evening she stayed longer than usual. Not because she required dramatic rescue. Only because some nights one should not go home immediately to the wrong thoughts. She read while Lucian repaired the chronometer. She asked whether brass remembered polishing. He asked whether words resented translation. By the time she rose to leave, the tightness had left her mouth and the tiredness in her face had changed from strain to simple fatigue. At the door she said, "I suspect this shop has become bad for my independence." Lucian rested one hand lightly on the counter. "I would be sorry to damage it permanently." "Not permanently," she said, "only usefully." Winter came. It arrived first in the clarity of mornings, then in the earlier dark, then in the little iron cold that lives in keys and door handles. The square's fountain was shut off. Window displays changed to candles, wool, dried oranges, and late pears. The church bell sounded sharper in cold air, as if each note had been polished. Frost wrote temporary scripts at the corners of Lucian's front glass before the stove had properly warmed the room. The watchmaker's shop became, in winter, even more distinctly outside ordinary time. Amber light against blue dark evenings. Clock faces glowing pale. Tea steaming. The layered ticking made warmer somehow by cold pressing at the panes. Eleanor came often enough now that her arrival had joined the room's weather. Not every evening, never demanded, but expected in the way one expects the quarter chime or the first lamp at dusk. Sometimes she brought work and sat in the armchair by the window, red pencil in hand, muttering against dead botanists or excessive adverbs. Sometimes she brought bread. Once she brought chestnuts in a paper sack, and they roasted them in the stove while the clocks looked on with mixed approval. Once Lucian read aloud a note found inside a grandfather clock case, written by a repairman in 1912 who had described the owner as hopeless with winding and surprisingly vigorous at argument. Eleanor nearly choked on her tea laughing. And still, beneath all this growing familiarity, they did not rush. There was affection, certainly, and ease, and a quiet, lengthening thread of care that neither pretended not to feel. Yet both were old enough to know that gentleness need not announce itself with urgency. Some things strengthen better under low steady flame. On the first snow of the season, the town changed shape entirely. By late afternoon the roofs had whitened. The square became quieter, sounds muffled and gentled. Footsteps left brief signatures. The florist closed early. The baker stayed open late and sold out of everything sweet. Lucian lit the lamps before dusk was fully due because snow makes darkness feel nearer than it is. Eleanor arrived with snow on her shoulders. When she stepped inside and pulled back the hood of her coat, tiny crystals melted in her hair. "I nearly did not come," she said. Lucian took her gloves, set them near the stove to dry, and replied, "That would have been a severe procedural failure." "I see." The clocks prepared themselves. The clocks are manipulative. Only in winter. She laughed and moved toward the window, where snow beyond the glass transformed the square into a soft shifting brightness. Even after dark, the world seemed lit from below. Lucian poured tea. For a long while they said very little. Snow asks for less language. It alters the acoustics of thought. The room glowed. The clocks went on. The church bell at 7 sounded far away, almost underwater. Eleanor sat in the armchair wrapped in the wool blanket Lucian kept folded for customers who arrived unreasonably cold. Lucian worked at the bench and found his attention divided, pleasantly and without loss, between the small regulator spring before him and the visible fact of her there. At last Eleanor said, "Do you ever think about the lives we might have had if we had made one or two different turns?" Lucian did not answer quickly. He set down the spring, removed the loop, and looked at the snow. "Yes," he said, "though less now than when I was younger. The older I become, the less I trust imagined versions of myself. They are usually too elegant." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Mine are too. They never account for bills, or damp weather, or difficult relatives, or the fact that one would still be oneself in them." "Exactly." She drew the blanket more closely around her knees. "My aunt used to say that fantasy is often autobiography dressed for dinner." Lucian almost laughed. "I wish I had known her. You would have admired her watch discipline." "I already do." The snow thickened. By 8 the square had nearly disappeared into a white hush. Lucian checked the small clock above the door and said, "You should not walk home in that." Eleanor looked up. "I live 6 minutes away. In weather that agrees. Tonight it does not." "Are you proposing imprisonment?" "I am proposing supper." That surprised them both less than it might once have. Lucian had, in the back room, a pot of lentil soup, a heel of hard cheese, half the rosemary bread, and 2 apples. Eleanor looked toward the curtain. The room beyond was modest. She knew this already, yet crossing from the front shop to the back room felt, to both of them, like the acknowledgement of a threshold long visible and only now approached. "I would like that," she said. So they went behind the curtain. The back room was warmer than the shop, not because the stove burned hotter there, but because the ceiling was lower and the domestic scale gentler. The table by the window held a folded newspaper, a jar of wooden spoons, the dried fennel stems, and the candle Eleanor had brought him 2 weeks ago when the florist ran out of proper tapers. The armchair here was plain but comfortable. The shelves held books in unruly rows. Poetry, repair manuals, maritime histories, a cookbook with notes in Celeste's hand still tucked at the front. Eleanor noticed everything, but discreetly. Lucian ladled soup into bowls. He sliced bread. He cut the cheese. Snowlight made the back window glow faint silver, even after dark. When they sat at the small table, the room seemed to contract into exactly the right size for 2 people who had spent months learning one another in increments. The soup was good because winter excuses simplicity if the heat is honest. Eleanor tasted it and said, "This is a serious soup." Lucian looked up. "Serious. It has convictions." "I hoped it might." They ate. The clocks in the front shop sounded softer from here, filtered by the curtain and the room's smaller walls. They no longer dominated. They accompanied. Now and then one chime drifted through, rounding the silence rather than dividing it. Eleanor touched the edge of her bowl. "Did Celeste sit here?" Lucian paused only briefly. The question was not sudden in the wrong way. It had arrived because the room had already become trustworthy. "Yes," he said, "at this table, usually with a book," though she claimed not to read during supper and then did. Eleanor smiled, sensibly dishonest. She would have approved of that description. Lucian looked at the cookbook near the shelf. A slip of paper marked one page. Celeste's handwriting had faded only slightly. "Add more time than seems wise." For years he had eaten in this room with memory sitting across from him so clearly that it needed no invitation. Tonight, for the first time, the memory did not feel displaced. Nor did it feel like an obstacle. It was simply part of the room's truth. Eleanor seemed to understand this without requiring explanation. She did not lower her voice into pity. She did not avoid the evidence of another life. She sat at the table with Lucian and the clocks and the snow and all that had come before. And by doing so made the evening larger rather than conflicted. After supper they shared the apples, sliced thin, with the cheese remnants. The candle burned low. Snow continued to write itself onto the town. At last Eleanor stood at the back window and looked out into the little courtyard where the herb box slept under white. "It feels," she said, "as though the whole world has been wrapped and put away except this room." Lucian came to stand beside her, though not too close. "Winter is persuasive that way." "And yet," she said, eyes on the snow, "I am not lonely in it." Lucian turned his head slightly. Eleanor did too. There are moments when everything one might say becomes too large for the room if spoken directly. This was one of them. So Lucian did not say, "You are changing the architecture of my evenings." He did not say I had forgotten what it was to expect a footstep before the bell. He did not say there are rooms in me that have been shut for years and somehow your voice has found the hinges. He only said, with the accuracy he trusted most, "No." Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer, then smiled with a softness that altered the whole winter. When the snow eased enough for her to walk home, Lucian found the umbrella again. Though she said it was absurd under snowfall, he insisted. At the door, before drawing on her gloves, she rested one hand lightly on the counter and said, "Lucian." "Yes. This has become more than tea." He felt the truth of that in the very boards beneath his feet. "Yes," he said. Eleanor looked down once, as if steadying herself on the visible grain of the counter, then back up. "I am not asking for declarations. I distrust them in weather like this." "So do I." "Good." A small pause. Snow beyond the glass. Clockwork around them. Amber light between. "But I thought," she said, "it should be named." Lucian nodded slowly. "I am glad it has been." She put on her gloves. He handed her the umbrella. Their fingers touched briefly at the handle. Nothing dramatic. Skin, wool, a pulse of human nearness entirely disproportionate in its effect. After she left, Lucian remained by the counter for a long time. "More than tea." "Yes." The clocks agreed by continuing. Days turned. The pendant watch was finished at last. Lucian polished the case but left the dent by the hinge. Just as promised, he regulated it carefully, knowing it would never become an exact instrument and should not be forced into one. Some watches, like some people, are improved by accuracy only up to the point where it ceases to be themselves. When Eleanor came to collect it, he set the watch on a square of dark velvet and let her hear it before she touched it. Tick, tick, tick. The smallest smile came to her mouth, but her eyes changed more. They held surprise first, then tenderness, then a kind of grief transformed into gratitude so quickly the two were nearly indistinguishable. "It sounds like her hallway," she said. Lucian understood immediately, not the literal hallway, but the atmosphere of it. Lessons at 4, tea at 5, shoes lined by the wall. A domestic pulse no one notices until it vanishes and then suddenly hears forever. Eleanor lifted the watch in her palm. "Thank you," Lucian almost said for the watch. Or "no thanks needed," or some other respectable diminishing phrase. Instead he said, "You are welcome." She attached the chain to her dress and tucked the watch into the pocket seam at her waist. "It feels strange," she said, "as if something I had quietly agreed was over has reconsidered." Lucian rested both hands on the bench. Old mechanisms can be persuasive. Eleanor looked at him for a beat too long to be accidental. "Yes," she said. That evening, after the last customer and the last chime of the church bell, the town's electricity failed. It happened in winter sometimes. A line iced. A transformer complained. Someone in the municipal office used language unsuited to public service. Then the square darkened all at once and every window lost its white certainty. The clocks, however, did not care. Lucian lit candles. One on the front counter, one at the bench, one in the back room. The shop changed immediately. Without electric glow, the amber of flame returned everything to older proportions. Brass looked warmer, glass deeper, shadows more sincere. Pendulums crossed candlelight in thin bronze arcs. The window gave back only darkness and the faintest reflection of the room itself. The bell over the door sounded and Eleanor entered carrying a lantern. "I suspected," she said, lifting it slightly, "that this place without electricity might become unbearable in its beauty and should be supervised." Lucian looked at the lantern, then at her. An admirable civic instinct. She came in smiling, cheeks bright from cold. The pendant watch hung at her waist now and gave a tiny sound when she moved. Lucian noticed it at once. "The town is in uproar," Eleanor said. 3 people outside the bakery were behaving as if the 19th century had personally insulted them. "They should come here. It is doing very well." And it was. By candlelight the shop no longer seemed merely outside ordinary time. It seemed removed from century altogether. Clocks glowed. Brass hands moved over enamel faces with almost ceremonial slowness. The chime of the rosewood tenant became richer, as if wood liked fire better than wires. Eleanor set the lantern on the front counter, and together its steady flame and the candles made the whole room drift beyond haste. They sat without tea at first, unwilling to disturb the perfection of looking. At last Eleanor said, almost in a whisper though none was required, "This is the room I was trying to find when I walked past your window in the rain." Lucian turned toward her. "I did not know it then," she continued, "only that something in me recognized the light before I could explain it." He listened. "I think," she said, "I had been living in bright efficient rooms so long that I forgot I was made for gentler ones." Lucian felt the sentence with a kind of physical clarity. He answered not with philosophy, nor with comfort, but with truth equal in size. "I had forgotten," he said, "that gentleness could arrive from outside oneself." The candles moved slightly in a draught. The clocks ticked on. Eleanor looked down at her hands, then back up, and there, in the golden shadow of the powerless winter shop, everything became at once simpler and more irrevocable. She stood. Lucian rose too, though not from uncertainty, merely because some moments require a body to meet them fully. They stood near the bench, the candle between them throwing light upward into their faces. No one hurried, no one filled the air with unnecessary explanation. The shop had spent months teaching them interval, proportion, the discipline of not forcing what was already becoming. Eleanor said, almost smiling, "I would not object, at this point, if you kissed me." Lucian felt laughter and tenderness reach him together. "I am relieved," he said, "to have the matter clarified." Then he kissed her. It was not the kiss of young people trying to outrun uncertainty. It was not a dramatic correction to loneliness. It was a quiet, deliberate meeting, warm with months of earned familiarity. The kind of kiss that arrives after listening, after tea, after shared silences and clocks and winter and rooms honestly seen. When they parted, the smallest mantel clock chimed the quarter from the back room, as if in approval or unbearable timing. Eleanor laughed softly against his shoulder. "Even now," she said, "they require participation. They have always been theatrical." They stood a little while longer, not embracing tightly, only near enough to feel that the space between them had changed category. Outside, the town remained dark. Inside, the clocks kept on. Tick, click, chime, return. When the electricity finally resumed, white lights sprang up in windows across the square one by one. The florist's lace curtains reappeared. The bakery sign glowed. Somewhere down the street, someone cheered sarcastically. Lucian and Eleanor blinked at the sudden return as if waking from a century they had briefly inhabited together. "Well," Eleanor said, smoothing her sleeve with unnecessary seriousness, "that was inconveniently perfect." Lucian almost smiled. The municipal office should be informed. They drank tea after all. Then she went home through the newly lit streets. And Lucian closed the shop with hands steadier than they had been in years. Though not because he was less moved. Rather because at last movement and peace had entered the same room. By spring, the town had adjusted. Not to scandal, there was none, only to pattern. Eleanor's scarf on the chair by the window. Lucian carrying 2 paper parcels from the market instead of 1. The baker sending sugared buns, by mistake, every Thursday. The florist pretending not to notice when Lucian bought yellow tulips and then bought 'em again the week after. Mrs. Ansell, upon seeing Eleanor's pendant watch running at her waist, nodded once as if some private municipal standard had been met. Nothing about the shop became less itself. The clocks continued at their preferred drifts and dignities. The regulator remained exact. The sunburst kitchen clock remained 3 minutes fast. The rosewood tenant continued observing all with restored composure. Tea was still poured in the blue pot with the ill-fitting lid. Work was still work. Lucian still repaired, adjusted, listened, and recorded. Eleanor still translated botanists, letters, philosophers, and the occasional legal widow with grievances. And yet the shop had altered in the one way that matters most. It no longer merely kept a different time. It kept a shared one. On certain evenings, when spring rain tapped lightly at the glass and the square blurred gold under lamplight, Lucian would look up from the bench to find Eleanor in the blue armchair. Reading, or not reading, simply listening with her head tilted slightly while the quarter chimes moved around the room. And he would think, with no urgency now, no fear of naming it too soon, that this was what had returned. Not youth. Not replacement. Not rescue. Only the quiet, astonishing fact that after long years of measured solitude, the room had opened and another life had entered without violence, without demand, and had taken its place among the clocks as naturally as if time itself had arranged it. Late one evening, much later, when the square had emptied and the sky beyond the roofs held the soft lavender grey of ending day, Eleanor said from the armchair, "Do you remember the question I asked the first night?" Lucian looked up from the bench. "About rooms keeping different time." "Yes. I remember." She closed the book in her lap. "I think I would answer it differently now." Lucian set down the screwdriver. "How?" Eleanor looked around the shop. At the clocks, the lamplight, the bench, the front window darkening into reflection, the chair where she sat, the man she had come to love by increments entirely proportionate to his nature. "I think some rooms do not keep different time," she said. "I think they return time to its right size." Lucian leaned back in his chair. The clocks around them continued, not hurried, not delayed, each in its own measured truth. "Yes," he said. "And because it was evening. Because the tea was hot. Because the light was amber and the room no longer floated outside time alone but within it properly inhabited." They let the silence after that become part of the answer. The quarter chime sounded. The rain eased. The town, beyond the glass, went on with its ordinary briefness. And inside the watchmaker's shop, where every clock moved slowly and honestly under warm gold light, where old things had been mended without erasing their dents, where solitude had learned at last to make room, the evening continued, quiet and exact, as if there were all the time in the world.